And so we talked about this last week. Almost all is lost for Job. And I want to say that because I want us to understand that he still had something, right? And the reason I want to point that out is because there's a lot of times in our lives where, if I'm being honest, we feel like we have nothing. We feel like we don't have anyone. We feel like we don't really have anything. But it's really not true. It may be hard for us to see that. There may be some low-hanging clouds, if I'm being honest. But the prime example. So let me backtrack a little bit. When I was in school, we studied psychological disorders, right? And we talked about how Winnie the Pooh, like the cast of Winnie the Pooh, was like the perfect example of so many of these psychological disorders. Rabbit was obviously OCD. Tigger was the definition of ADHD. We talked about Eeyore, and Eeyore was very much suffered from depression, right? And so here's the thing, right? Like Eeyore always walked around, and I love talking about Eeyore because I always love getting to break into the Eeyore voice, which I feel like I never get to do enough. And so like, remember, like everybody would be doing great. And then like you'd see Eeyore come in and like, it was just like everything just changed all of a sudden, right? Like there'd be like a little cloud like hanging over him, or like he'd be upset because like he'd lost his tail and he's like, oh, it fell off somewhere back there. We're just gonna have to find it later, or maybe never at all. You get what I'm saying? Like Eeyore found a way to just kind of suck the joy right out of the room, right? And it's not, I'm not saying it's Eeyore's fault, just like I'm not saying that for us to be in those moments where we kind of feel that way, that it's our fault. It's not really anyone's fault. Like you have to understand that. Like there are things at play here. There are things at work here that are bigger than us. That's the point I want you to take from this. And the thing is, here's Job, who is thinking that he's having a regular night. And we talked about this last week, right? How like a messenger would come in and be like, hey, all of your animals were stolen. Hey, half your servants were killed. Hey, your house collapsed on top of your children. Hey, all of these things are happening. And Job barely has a chance to process one of these things, which one of these things would have been enough, right? Like one of these things, to lose all of your wealth would have been enough for some people to just be like, oh my gosh, I have nothing. It happens. Like you can go read stories about people. There's TV shows about this, about people who once upon a time were wealthy, once upon a time had positions of power and everything. And then it's just all in a moment lost and gone. It's just not there anymore. And so one of these things would have been enough, right? Even servants, you have to understand that servants at this time were not just like hired helpers. Servants were a lot of times part of your family, because the reason that they were serving you was because their family before you had served, or they had served you as children and they grew up in the home. And so a lot of times these servants were an extended part of the family. And so now Job has lost all of them. And then, as if all of that isn't enough, Job receives words that all of his children were feasting together, which by the way, can I just point out for a second, as the father of 4 children, that to get your kids all together is difficult enough. To get them to get together because they wanted to get together and to get along is even more crazy. And then in that moment, they just so happen to be together, hanging out, and death falls upon them. And we struggle with this, right? Like, so tonight we're addressing this issue of, if God is all powerful and if God has knowledge of this, why does evil still continue to happen? Why does evil happen to me? Why does evil happen in this world? Like, this is one of those really big questions. Now, I'm going to preface this in the beginning, like I do anytime that I talk about something similar to this. At the end of this lesson, you may find yourself going, nah, that was kind of I don't know that I like that answer. Come talk to me. Let's have a conversation about it. Because you have to understand, we've talked about this before. We serve a supernatural God who thinks on a different level, right? His ways are above our ways. His thoughts are far beyond our thoughts, and on and on. So here's God up here, and here's us trying to make sense of it all. And we can't. Like, if I'm being honest with y'all, we just can't. And further, we have to just kind of be okay with that. We have to just kind of accept the fact that, like, hey, I can't explain everything. Hey, I don't have answers for every question. We've talked about this as we've been studying apologetics on Sunday nights. There are some questions that I just look at people and I go, man, it's a really good question. And I don't know the answer to it. I can find the best answer I can find, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to walk away and be like, well, that makes perfect sense now. Like, again, we're talking about God who's way up here, not like in a physical sense, but just, I mean, he's the creator of the universe, guys. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I struggled enough with calculus when I was in high school, right? Like, here's God way up here, and we're trying to understand him. It's just very difficult for us. It's a challenge, but we can do the best that we can. And that's what I want to do. I don't want to just dismiss it and be like, tough cookie, just accept it. It's just the way it goes. Like, I don't ever want to give that answer. Like, I want to try to help us make sense of it. So like I said, Job had lost 7,000 sheep, something like 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, 500 female donkeys, 7 sons, 3 daughters, and a partridge in a pear tree. Like, Job loses almost everything, right? Like he's really struggling with this. By the way, I'm going to like interject these jokes just so it's not so heavy. Don't feel like creepy or dark if you're like, partridge in a pear tree. That's funny. Like, it's okay. Like, it's okay for us to laugh. Like, I've done this. Look, guys, I've done funerals before where I made jokes, and you have to remind everybody, like, it is okay for us to laugh. You can mourn and cry and still laugh. You can hurt and laugh. Something I learned about depression a long, long time ago is that even in a depressive episode or even in a state of intense depression, it's okay to love and it's okay to laugh. And you have to tell yourself that, because sometimes you sit there and you tell yourself like, no, I can't be happy. I don't deserve to be happy. Or all of these other kind of crazy things that I really believe that Satan wants us to think. And it's just not true. It's just not true. So anyway, he loses all of this. Remember, Satan is talking to God about Job, and Satan's like, of course Job worships you. Of course Job thinks that you're great. Of course Job loves God, because you've given him everything and you've protected him. God, you've protected him. That's not real faith. And I kind of get it, right? Like, can I be honest with you guys? Let me be vulnerable with y'all for a second. When I was growing up and I was struggling with some of the things that I had to unfortunately struggle with as a young person growing up, and even as an adult, there's just a lot of things that I felt like everybody else, the cards always fell their way, and I always got the short end of the stick. Everybody else is, just living a perfect life. Their parents have 2.5 kids and live in a nice house and all that. And I felt like I kind of got cheated in some ways. And there were other things going on, but just understand that, like, I would look at normal kids and I would be like, why can't my life be more like that? Even as I became an adult, I would look at other adults and I'd be like, why don't I have that? Why don't I get that? Like, I feel like I'm a good person, right? Like, I feel like I've done things right. Why do I get cheated, right? And so Satan is sitting here and he's telling you, or he's telling God, rather, sorry. He's telling God, he's like, of course Job is going to be a good person. You've given him everything. Of course why wouldn't he? He'd be stupid to be angry with you, God. Nothing bad has happened to him. And so God says, okay, you know what? You can do whatever you want to him. Just don't touch him. Don't touch him. And so so Satan says, okay. And he gets to work. And here's the thing, and we talked about this last week. As we get to the end of all of this, Job's wife, I don't know that we actually got to this verse last week, but Job's wife, after Job continues to praise God, even in his mourning, Job's wife is going to tell him, and we're going to talk about this verse more in the future. I just want you to know, Job's wife is going to say, you know what, Job? After all that we've been through the last few minutes, the last couple of days, it would be better for you to just go ahead and get this over with. It'd be better for you to just curse God and die. Make God angry with you so that God goes ahead and finishes the job. Because whatever you've done to God, obviously he's mad at you. And rather than continue to just live a life of God's wrath, just get up in his face and challenge him and just let him strike you dead. Like, you're better off, Job. You're just better off. And Job doesn't do it. Job doesn't fall for that. Job doesn't give in to that. He doesn't take what I would call the easy way out. And he's been through it, right? Like, I'm sitting here and I'm writing the notes, and I wrote here, like, example, like there's an old song. It's like, you had a bad day. Like, y'all know that old song, right? Like, that's what I'm thinking. Like, I feel like, he's walking around and like this song is just playing. The camera don't lie. Like, it's just going on and on about how he's having this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. No, gosh, no. Anyway, but seriously, he's struggling here. Like, and that's okay, right? Like, I want you guys to understand that even though things are hard on Job right now, and he's struggling, and he's, for what we read, remaining faithful, it's okay that he's having a hard time with this. It's okay for us to wrestle with this, because here's the deal. If you're going to wrestle, if you're going to struggle, God would prefer for you to come to him. See, like, this is the thing. We live in this world and in this society, if I can be so honest with you, we live in this world and this society where we're kind of like quick to get offended. Like, oh, you said what? You don't agree with me? Don't you know that I'm right? Why don't you just do it my way, right? Like, you get what I'm saying? And like, I think we just have to accept and understand that sometimes it's not in the cards for us, for everybody to see things our way and to do it our way. And that's kind of where he finds himself. And so if we look in the book of Psalm, which is actually the very next book, Psalm chapter 37, verse 28, let me read it for you right quick. It says, "For the Lord loves justice, but he will not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the children of the wicked shall be cut off." Now, when it's talking about the children of the wicked, understand it's the people who choose to not follow God, to not give their life to him. So it's not like, bad kids that are born of bad parents or something like that. It's the people who say, "Do you love the Lord God?" And they're like, "No." That's what this is talking about. These particular people who have made this choice to not be followers of him, but to chase after, pursue other things. That's kind of who he's talking about. It's those children of the wicked, those who choose sin, those who choose to worship other things other than God. So he doesn't forsake us, but he calls us to a deeper trust in him. That's why I love that song that we did last week that Jake did, and I wrote the lyrics down in my notes again. "The harder the wind will blow, the deeper my roots will go." And that's the point, right? So growing up in South Texas along the coast, we have palm trees. And I don't know what y'all know about palm trees, but palm trees are really solid. Like, you watch them like in videos of like hurricanes coming in and they're just like blowing, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, like, how does that tree not snap? Well, the reason why is they're very deeply rooted, for one, but not just that, but they're very solid. Like, for a palm tree to be blowing like that has to be some really strong winds. I've had friends that have had car accidents where they've hit palm trees before, and palm trees don't give. They're very solid. And that's the way we have to be in our faith. Like, I know that this is a lot for your teenage brains to sometimes accept, because sometimes you kind of think there's got to be more to it than that, or what if this happens, or what about that? By the way, I didn't mean that as like an insult. I realize now that kind of sounded bad. That's not what I meant. But anyway, The thing I want you to understand is that God just wants you to trust him and let him help carry you through whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever difficulty that you may have, whatever hard time you're trying to get through. It's just to trust him. And this is the problem. We partly trust God, and then when things get hard, we give up and try our own thing again. You know? Think about Peter walking on the water, right? Like Peter gets out of the boat. Jesus is like, come on, Peter. Peter gets out of the boat. He's walking on water, right? Then the waves start tossing and the wind starts blowing. And he takes his focus off of Jesus, and he puts his focus on the storm. And the moment he puts his focus on the storm, what happens? He starts to sink, right? Same thing with us. We sit there and we say, I love God. This is Job right here. I love God. I serve him. And Satan's like, watch this. I'm gonna make the storm around him go crazy, and you watch. Job's going to start sinking. But here's the deal. Job never starts sinking. And some of you are going to sit there and you're going to say, well, wait a second. I'm not like Job. Or wait a second. That's the reason why Job has an entire book of the Bible written about him, because he obviously had great faith. I'm not like Job, but you could be. You could be. You just got to let some things go. We got to let go of those things that cause us to sink. We got to let go of shifting our focus from God to the world, and just keep our focus on him. And a lot of you are going to say, I've tried that. And I'm going to tell you, and I respectfully disagree when I say this. If your focus continued to be on God, you wouldn't have sank. And I'm not saying that as like, well, you didn't do it right. Like I've always got this out. Like, I feel like some preachers do that. Like some preachers will tell you, well, you didn't have strong enough faith. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is it's a lifelong process. It's an evolving, it's an evolution. It is, true faith is not momentary. True faith is long lasting. It's permanent. It's not just whenever this bad thing happens. It's more and it's bigger than that. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. And so when we look at this, we look at some men in the Bible. We look at Jacob in the book of Genesis, chapter 37. Jacob is going to get word from his sons, who, by the way, want to kill his son Joseph. They throw him in a deep hole and they want to leave him. Then they take him out of the hole just to sell him as a slave. But regardless, they take his coat, they cover it in blood, they take it back to their father, and they're like, look, your son Joseph, your favorite son, the son who you bought this really nice coat for. You didn't give the rest of us a nice coat, but that's beside the point, Dad. We're not mad about it. He's dead. And this is what Jacob does. Chapter 37, verse 34. This is what it says. And then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son for many days. Jacob is one of our patriarchs. He's one of the, if I will, founding fathers of our faith. He's one of the founding fathers of literally the Jewish nation, right? And in this moment, what does he do? He mourns. He mourns. Let's jump over a couple of more books to the book of 2 Samuel. We're going to read about David. Remember, David is going to commit adultery with Bathsheba, who is married to another man. And if we go to 2 Samuel and we turn to chapter 12, we're going to read about what happens. And so Bathsheba is going to get pregnant. David's going to get her husband killed. And then, kind of like, well, what happens now? 2 Samuel chapter 12, starting in verse 15, this is what it said. And the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife Bathsheba bore to David, and he became sick. And David therefore sought God on behalf of the child. And David fasted, and he went and he laid on the ground all night. And the elders of his house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. And on the seventh day the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him that the child is dead? He may do himself some harm. But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." And then David arose from the earth, washed and anointed himself, changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord, and he worshiped. And he then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Now, again, I understand that these are different emotions. This is two situations where fathers are struggling with the loss of their children. This is not easy for anyone. It's not easy today. It wasn't easy back then, even though the Bible, I feel like in some ways makes this sound very easy. I don't want you to think for a second that it's easy. I don't want you to think for a second that God's angry with you if it's not easy for you. A lot of us have experienced loss. Some of us have experienced loss even recently. And it's okay in that to hurt. It's okay in that to struggle. It's okay in that to go to God and ask him questions. We see about Mary and Martha in the New Testament, John chapter 11. We hear about Mary and Martha's brother, Lazarus, who dies. Lazarus was a friend of Jesus. Lazarus and Mary and Martha are very close with Jesus. And I'm going to go a step further. They're in the town of Bethany. Bethany just happens to be like 2 miles away from Jerusalem, which is where Jesus is at. And so Lazarus is going to die, and it's going to take Jesus several days to get back to them. And so when Jesus does make his way back, we see in John chapter 11, verse 21, this is what Martha says. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." That's what she says to Jesus, the Son of God. And here's the thing. She understands who Jesus is because she's been listening to Jesus' teaching. She's very close to Jesus. I feel like she even understands Jesus better than some of Jesus' disciples understand Jesus. And she looks at Jesus square in the eyes. Here's the deal. Martha doesn't even want to come talk to Jesus. Or maybe it's Mary. What did I just read? Anyway. One of the sisters doesn't even want to come talk to Jesus. The other one comes to talk to Jesus and says, "Hey, what took you so long? If you'd have got here sooner, my brother would still be alive." This is how they talk to the Son of God. So don't think for a second, and by the way, I totally believe that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus to this day are in heaven. So don't think for a second that just because you go to God and you're like, "God, why? Why is such evil happening? Why am I wrestling with these bad things? Why me and not anybody else? Why do I feel like all the people around me have everything, like they have their life together and things are going great and their parents are normal and they're not weird and they're not divorced and they're together and they have money and blah, 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 blah." I don't go blah, blah, blah. Anyway, why do they have all of this and I got nothing? And you think God's going to be like, some of you guys have had this happen. You had me in class before. Don't talk to Mr. Copeland that way. Like, that's not the way that God works. You will not, whose name is on the door? You will not disrespect me that way. It's not the way that God works. He wants you to bring your pain to him. He wants you to bring your troubles to him. I tell my kids all the time, I don't care what you're wrestling with. I don't care what you're struggling with. Come talk to me about it so we can work through it. Because I don't want you to go through it alone. And God is way better than I am. And he wants for the same thing. He wants you to bring that to him. So here's the question. If God has the power to stop these things, why doesn't he? If God has the power, if God could have stopped Lazarus from dying before he died, why didn't he do it? If Jesus could have got there sooner, why didn't he get there sooner? If God knew that man was going to sin, why didn't he stop Satan from ever being created? If God knew that, all of these bad and evil and wild things, if God knows, if he knows everything, if he knows this is coming, if he sees it, why doesn't he stop it? Why doesn't he keep these things from happening? And there's a few points I want to talk about real quick. Well, let me ask another question. Is there a good reason for evil? That's something that I hear a lot. Like, there's got to be a reason, right? Like, there's got to be a good reason why God lets these things happen. Same thing with Lazarus, right? Like if we read a little further in John chapter 11, we see that Jesus is going to resurrect Lazarus from the dead. And what do you think is going to happen? Everybody's going to praise God, right? Now, some of you are like, but wait a second. This bad thing in my life didn't lead to people praising God. And so I go back to this question of, is there a good reason for this level of evil? Is there a good reason why we have the things going on in our world that we have going on right now? Is there a good reason why we have these things going on in our church that we have going on in our church right now? Is there a good reason why I struggle with this at school? Why my home life is this way? And on and on and on. Is there a good reason for any of it? And I'm going to answer you quite honestly, probably not that meets our definition. Some of you would say, well, that's a reason, but it's not a good reason, right? We want a good reason for why these things happen. So there's a man, by the way, there's a movie about this. It's called Into the Spear. It's a guy by the name of Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot was a missionary who went into Ecuador to the rainforest on a missionary journey to witness to a tribe of wild natives who'd never heard about God, and he wanted to tell them about God. Does that sound like a bad guy? No. Guess what happened? He got there, they killed him. And the 4 guys that he got there with. Guess what happened when his wife found out? Mama Bear. Guess what happened when she found out? She wanted to go over there, and she wanted to minister to them. And she wanted to forgive them. And guess what happened? She went over there, and the village got to hear the gospel. They came to know the Lord. Now, some of you are sitting there and you're like, well, that's a crazy story. It is. Some of you are like, that's not me, right? Like I started telling you about his wife, and y'all were like, woo, yeah, I know where this is going. This sounds like a movie. That's not the way she handled it. Why? Because she wasn't driven by revenge. She was driven by love of the Lord. Now, some of you are like, okay, but it's the truth. We have to get to that place in our lives. We have to get to that place of faith. We have to get to that deeper rooted love of God like we're talking about. Could God have done it in a different way? Sure. But we're pretending that our way is better. We're pretending that we know more than he does. We're pretending that God should check with us first, or he should think about doing things our way. And I feel like that's a very dangerous place to be, because you're exalting yourself to a level of godliness. And what comes next is, guess what? Idolatry. And sometimes that's of yourself. Self-exaltation. And it's pride, and it's something that we have to be very careful about. Could he have done it different? Absolutely. Same thing with Lazarus. Lazarus probably woke from the dead and was like, hey, could you have found a way to make this happen where, I didn't have to die? Maybe. Doesn't hurt so much. In our definition, probably. But in God's way, no. And we have to understand that God just has a different way. He has a different way because he sees the world in a different way than we do. And so to further go on with this, we don't always know why God allows evil. We don't always know that. We can't possibly know that. It's outside of our understanding. But here's what I do know. I know that the valleys help me see. I know that the valleys help me see the hills better. Let me give you an example of that. For years, Christy and I tried to have children, and she'd get pregnant and we'd lose the baby. She'd get pregnant, we'd lose the baby. We went through this like 6-7 times. She'd get pregnant, we'd lose the baby. She'd get pregnant, she'd come up with a name, we'd get excited, we'd lose the baby. And it hurt. And it got us to very different points, because every time a baby would come, she'd want to talk about names, and guess what Robert would do? I don't want to name it. It's just going to hurt more. I don't want to decorate the room for the baby. I don't want to tell people, because then when we lose the baby, I got to go back and I got to tell those people we lost the baby. Or when they come to you and they're excited and they're like, how far along is Christy? And then I got to tell her, no. And so when Jeremiah was born and when Benjamin was born, and I held them, it's hard for me to explain to you guys, but it was very different because I'd walked through the valleys. It was different because I'd struggle with that. And I'll be honest with you, in some ways it was still really hard for me, but it made it greater having gone through difficult times. And I say that to say this. I can remember playing sports and like going through two-a-days and going through workouts, and I can remember running until I was throwing up on the side and like all of these things that you do. And so when you would win, or when you'd make a good play, it made all of those things worth it. It made those struggles, those difficult times, those early mornings, those late nights, it made all of that worth it. Because you'd gone through the tough times to celebrate the good times. I know the valleys help me see the hills better. But why, Robert? Why do these things have to happen? Well, guess what? Humans have freedom. They have human freedom. They have free will. We've talked about this before. I can't stop you. I can't stop you from laughing while I'm telling a story about my babies dying, like some people are doing over here. I can't stop you from looking at your phone instead of paying attention. I can't stop you from being more interested in picking up girls than listening to what I have to say. I can't stop you from any of those things. I don't have the power or the ability to do that. And it's like I talked about last week, right? Like every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Like if you do something, something else is going to happen back. Newton's cradle, right? Have y'all ever seen that thing with the silver balls and it's got like rope hanging and like you pull one and then like one swings out and you pull two and then like two swings out? You know what I'm talking about? Same thing in life. If you walk up to a big tough guy and you punch him in the face, we talked about this last week, guess what? He's probably not going to just be okay with that. There's probably going to be a reaction. And so in that is, because here's the deal. If God interjects himself into everything that we do, it's not freedom. And worship is when you put everything else down, when you set everything else aside and you come to God and you give it all to him. God's not forcing you to be at church. God's not forcing you to listen to that music. God's not making you sing that song. You're doing it out of an overflow of your heart. And so in those tough times, we praise and worship him. That's what Joseph did. That's what Jacob did. That's what David did. And when Lazarus raises from the dead, that's what Mary and Martha and all the villagers and all the family members and all the people close to him are going to do. They're going to praise and worship God because he was brought back from the dead. Cause and effect. We've talked about this, cause and effect. There's an old expression about how a small ripple or a marble dropped in the ocean can cause a tidal wave across the world. Same thing. A seemingly little thing in our life can be catastrophic to someone else's, can be huge to somebody else. Cause and effect. Sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's what we call a meaningful action. So what that means is, we talked about 9/11 a little bit last week. So what happened was when 9/11 happened, guess what? They started tightening up airport security. They started trying to do things to stop things from like that from ever happening again. Meaningful action. Every time I lose somebody close to me, I always just want to tell everybody that I know, hug your loved ones a little tighter. Check on your friends. Make sure they're okay. Love people. Don't go to bed angry. Set aside your differences, all that kind of stuff. Life is too short, and guess what? It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. The things we hang on to, the things we allow ourselves to get angry about, the things that we want to be mad at each other about, they just don't matter. And yet we hang on to them like they do. God has reasons we'll never understand. Let me just be honest with you. God has reasons we'll never understand. There's one more quote I want to share with y'all. It's A.W. Tozer. He's an old preacher who just said a lot of wise stuff that we just quote. And A.W. Tozer wrote this: while it looks like things are out of control, behind the scenes there's a God who has not surrendered his authority. That's the thing we got to remember. Is like, just because our lives look like they're crazy, just like it looks like we're going a little wilding out, we don't have a handle on things. We don't have our lives together. It looks like there's not going to be a good day for a really, really long time. Guess what? God has not surrendered his authority. He hasn't given up control. He's still on the throne. It may not look the way that we think that it should look, but he still is. And so as we look at this story and this example of Job, we see things are looking really low for Job, but in the end, Job is going to come out more faithful, stronger, and he's going to realize how blessed he is more than he ever did before. All right, let's pray. Father, I just thank you that you'd be with us. Just help us to understand things that happen, evil, aren't always meant for bad. We can learn, we can grow, we can more deeply plant our roots to know and understand you better. Be with us as we leave this place. Forgive us where we fail you, Lord, and just help us see you better and understand you more. It's the name of your Son, Jesus, and your Spirit we pray and we ask all these